have a really interesting panel coming up, which is called The Detectives and the Damned, Fictional Truths from History. We have three speakers. It's going to be a remarkable session, actually, in terms of the range of topics that they're going to cover. Very different, very different genre from a standard session at a History Lit Fest. I'll introduce them and invite them on stage. Begin with Madhulika Liddle. She's an award-winning novelist and short story writer, best known for historical fiction. Works include the Muzaffar Jung detective series and the Delhi Quartet. Her latest books are An Unholy Drought in 2024 and For the Love of Apricots in 2025. She also writes on cinema, travel, and culture. Next, we have Sadiqa Peerbhoy, award-winning advertising professional, columnist, and author of 8 books, including Merry-Go-Round and House of Discord. She was a former BBC scriptwriter. She has led creativity workshops and a British design college. She's passionate about Hindustani classical music, and she seamlessly blends humor and drama in her storytelling. Please welcome. Finally, we have Harini Nagendra, Director of the School of Climate Change and Sustainability at the Azim Premji University. She's an internationally recognized scholar on sustainability, recipient of multiple prestigious awards. She has co-authored acclaimed non-fiction and fiction books, including the Bangalore Detectives Club Mystery Series, and works on urban nature and sustainability. She's one of India's top-notch polymaths, as I would like to call her, who can literally do anything. So as if non-fiction was not enough, she said, let me try fiction, and she's doing extremely well in that. So the session begins now, and I'll hand over the floor to Harini to take the conversation forward. Before that, let me just invite Professor Rakesh Basant to give our speakers a stool. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Chinmay, for that very generous introduction to all of us. And it's a real pleasure for me to share, I think, this panel with 2 novelists whose work I admire very greatly. And I thought, so we're all here because we write different kinds of things, all of us. But I think what the books that we're going to talk about in this panel are a mix of books at various times of just the pre-colonial to the colonial period, right? And a time of when India is going through a lot of transition. So for instance, and I won't give you spoilers, but I think we basically go from 1625 to 1925. And that's the range that we're doing, which is a very, very interesting time in India. And we're looking at Delhi, we're looking at Hyderabad, we're looking at Bangalore, and the spread of cities in that place. So I'll first start maybe, and just to give you a sense of where we are, or one of the things I want to do is make sure that we have a lot of time for questions. So we'll try and do 1 hour of conversation between us, and then keep half an hour for audience questions. So please do, keep your questions for the last half an hour, but come up with stuff, because then we can make it more interesting in terms of, I think, as the audience participates, it's always much more fun, right? So I'll start maybe with you, Madhulika. Can you describe your books, especially the Muzaffar Jung series, but also the other series that you write now, the Delhi Quartet? Your characters, the period, the setting.
You can hear me, right? Okay, so because we're talking about detectives, so I'm here to talk about the detective I invented. His name is Muzaffar Jung. He's a Mughal detective, and he spread over 4 books, of which 3 are novels and 1 is a collection of short stories. So Muzaffar Jung is a 25-year-old nobleman who lives in Shahjahanabad, which is the city which Shah Jahan established in Delhi after he moved the capital from Agra. Right? So Muzaffar is about 25 years old when the first book starts, and he's a bit of a maverick. So he's not like your typical Mughal nobleman who would be very, very status conscious and very conscious of his class, and he would not mingle with the riff-raff, and extremely fashionable, the types who would go around dripping with jewels. Muzaffar is not that type. So Muzaffar is a maverick, and he one of his best friends is a lowly river boatman, and another friend is a jeweler's assistant, and this jeweler's assistant ends up being accused of a murder of a high-ranking nobleman, and that is how Muzaffar gets pulled into investigating. So that's how the whole story proceeds, and it's spread over 4 books about how Muzaffar solves various crimes, and he's surrounded by these people who sort of recur in the books. So one of them is his best friend, whose name is Akram, and Akram is the quintessential nobleman. He's a bit of a fop, and he's very fashionable. He loves flaunting jewelry and embroidered clothing and stuff like that. And another person who's very important is Muzaffar's sister, his older sister, who's like a sort of a mother figure to him. She's the one who brought him up, and she is married to the Kotwal of Delhi. So these people are the core. And later on, as the books proceed, Muzaffar falls in love with a woman called Shireen, and he ends up marrying her. So in fact, that is how the whole thing is set up. And through the books, I try to show what was happening in Delhi and around. So one of the books is actually set in Agra. So you get a taste of the Taj Mahal and stuff like that. So, so society, culture, what was happening in Mughal India as such also comes through.
Fascinating. And at least for me, the way I approach, learning about a new place or an old time, an unfamiliar place and time, is usually to start with fiction. I don't know about how many of you do the same. And typically, what I love about your books is it brings a time period of Delhi really alive, when it was mixing in so many ways, so much hybridness, so much fluidity, and from there, I think it's very nice to then go into a book of history and say, okay, this is what the building looks like. This is what people ate at the time. This is what the flowers or the trees were like, right?
And this is what, how they clean their hands after eating a meal. I didn't know this. With besan, chickpea flour.
Okay. Very interesting. So I was reading about, I think, Hyderabad, and they were saying that after... Oh, yours is indoors. Yeah, sorry. So, but I was reading about Hyderabad when you finish eating a meal, and apparently they used to wash their hands in tea water because your fingers then don't smell of the spices. So the funny things that you learn when you are looking at history. Yes, but over to you now. Please tell us about your book. And also why you chose to write it.
Hello. Yeah. This is my 9th book. It's called The Courtesan and the King. And it is possibly the second historical book of fiction that I've written. And it's very strange because it's a true story in the sense that the whole plot was ready. I had to fill in the background, I had to fill in the characters, I had to give them conversations and dialogues and things. And it becomes very tricky because, you don't know the personalities of the people you're writing about. You just have a sketchy storyline. So this is about it's around 1924-25. There's this young courtesan who's all of 13 years old, and she goes into the service of this Maharaja Holkar of Tukojirao Holkar of Indore. And she becomes his chief courtesan. But she doesn't, she has it all laid on in a lot of money and jewelry and things. But she wants to be a little more independent. She longs for love. She wants to, at that point of time, a lot of courtesans were going into the nascent film industry in Bombay. So she dreams of going there and, making her mark there, and she escapes. Then the rest of the story is all about how his ego is hurt, and he chases her from pillar to post. He has 12 people posted in Bombay in secrecy to follow her and to kidnap her, and he does kidnap her, and then she comes back again. And meanwhile, there's a young businessman called Abdul Razak Bawla, who falls in love with her, and she also feels emotion for him rather than just courtesan's duty or whatever. And she becomes his mistress, and she's carrying his child. And this prince, this Tukojira Holkar, he is kind of drunk on power, and he tries to get her kidnapped. And in the process, these 9 men attack them on Malabar Hill and drag her across the road, and she's pregnant. She loses the baby. And in the melee, this man who's with her takes a shot in his stomach, and he dies. So, and in the process, her nose gets sliced off. So then for the rest of her life, her career in films is put paid for, and she refuses to go back to the prince, the king. So it is a very humane story of resilience of this woman who wants more out of life than she's got, although she's got a lot of money and she's got a lot of riches and maybe some kind of position in Indore as a chief courtesan. And when this incident happened, she's only 25. And she's spent 11 years in the palace, virtually held a prisoner. And she educates herself. She has musicians coming to teach her. She has dance masters coming to teach her. She has somebody coming to teach her English. So she's educated herself. And the thing is, it's a bare storyline which I got. And then to fill it up with the color that's required for a novel is the most difficult task on earth, because you have to be credible. You have to dig deep into the research, into newspapers of the time. I went through maybe about 1,000 newspapers which are crumbling, all in the libraries in Bombay. And I went through the court records of that time. I went through the police records of that time. I went through a Marathi book published by one of the police officers who had access to the police records. So all that goes into it, and you want to be as authentic as possible. So I tried that. And then in the end, I met this niece of this Maharaja, who was alive, I think, till 99 or whatever. And she said, please be kind to him because he wasn't a villain. So I said, I'm not being unkind, or I'm not painting him a villain. These are facts that came through. And then for the rest of my life, this book was published last year. And I was petrified. I said, one of the descendants will come and sue me for libel or something or the other. But luckily, nobody did. A lot of them are around. And I know the family. And this Mumtaz's story is very inspirational, because till the end she couldn't speak English properly, yet she stood in court and she testified against the Maharaja. And one of her the attorneys on the Maharaja's side was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and one was S.G. Wellinkar, who happens to be a granduncle of my husband. So they were the top lawyers in the country, hired by this Maharaja to defend his people, his minions. And she withstood everything. She stood there and she said, I will never go back, no matter what. Even if he kills me here, I'd rather jump into the sea than go back to Indore. So she was a very brave little thing, and she knew her mind, and she was very kind of inspirational. And the rest of her life she spent in a flat which she had purchased, or the Baula had purchased for her on Chowpatty. Now the interesting bit is, when I was newly married, my mother-in-law knew this lady and the Maharaja. She was very close to the Maharaja. So she used to tell me this story about this courtesan who had her nose sliced off. So I heard this story and I found it very interesting, because she and her mother took all the jewels that the Maharaja had given them over a period of time and got off the train one station before Dehradun, where they used to go for the summer vacation with the Maharaja. And she ran away from there. So she used to tell me this, and believe me, it never struck me that here's a story that I could write about. And we used to pass that building near Chowpatty, and she used to say, look, Mumtaz stays there. Never occurred to me to write it. It was so strange. And then when the time came, I could have interviewed the person herself about her life, but it just never occurred to me. And finally, when it did, then I had to go to books and magazines, and not magazines, newspapers and things like that, and do my research. So that was a very interesting story, which was ready-made, but the rest of it had to be filled in with imagination.
And you have the book, I think. Can you show them?
I have it here.
And you should look up Madhulika's cover, which is very nice.
Courtesan and King.
Unfortunately, I don't have mine around.
I could send one to you.
And the books are available downstairs, I'm told. So please go look for them. And then let me tell you a bit about my book, which is the Bangalore Detectives Club, and it's a series also. So you have book 2, which is Murder Under a Red Moon, and book 3, which is A Nest of Vipers, and book 4 coming soon, July this year, which is Into the Leopard's Den. So I'm an ecologist, I think, as Chinmay was telling you, and I did a lot of work on Bangalore, urban ecology of Bangalore, and therefore the history of Bangalore. And while doing that, the idea for the main character popped into my head. It's set in 1920s Bangalore. And this is a young woman, Kaveri Murthy, who's just got married from Mysore and moved to Bangalore, discovering the city, and goes to Century Club, because Century Club being a very interesting place because it was the first Indian club, but then there were Britishers also allowed in there. So, and Vishweshwaraya, who was very well known, the former Diwan of Mysore, actually set up the Century Club as a response to the fact that in the what they call the bus club, the Bangalore United Services Club, which is now Bangalore Club, only British could go, or only white people could go. So the Indians were not allowed there. So he set up Century Club. Anyway, so Kaveri goes to Century Club for a party with her husband and stumbles across the corpse of a guy who turns out to be a local pimp. She sees a beautiful woman who's one of the women that he handles and she's being accused of the murder, and she's young and vulnerable, so she decides to help her. And then the rest of the mystery comes in, right? And it's called the Bangalore Detectives Club because a lot of the research that I do is on commons and communities. And I sort of firmly believe that no one does things alone. They always do it in groups. And I think both books, or the other books also, Sadiqa, yours, and certainly Madhulika, yours, shows that. So it's a club because there are lots of other sleuths along with her. There's her husband, Ramu, who's a doctor. And the way you write characters is also trying to see how I think different people can give you insights into different places. Like you have Muzaffar's brother-in-law is the Kotwal, so you get some access to official power. So through her husband, Ramu, who works in Bowring Hospital and whose boss is a Britisher, Kaveri has access to power and the realm of the British. Through her gossipy backhouse neighbor, Uma Auntie, and we all have an Uma Auntie in our lives somewhere, there's access to all of the other domestic arrangements, everybody's house, who came from where, who's married to whom, whose house has what domestic arrangements, who's running out of money, whose child has run away with someone else's child, what else going on the domestic front. So there's that. There's Inspector Ismail, who turns out to be she stumbles upon him in book 1, but he becomes one of her greatest supporters. There's their milk boy, Venu, who's a young little boy who helps them, and then he has a bunch of... So Ismail has a number of boys similar to the Baker Street Runner boys, who are a bunch of boys that go around the city because you always see small boys and they know everything. And it's a series really of adventures through Kaveri, who wants to study, who wants to do things on her own in a time and a generation where women weren't allowed to do very much. But there's also elements of people in mind. And I was just thinking about what you said, Sadiqa, about dealing with real people. And I think it must be very difficult to write that level of real fiction. And I guess my next question for you, Madhulika, will be about that. What I do, for instance, is one of the characters that is very inspirational to me was a woman who was a coffee entrepreneur in Bangalore. And she was called Dodamane Sakamma or Coffee Pudi Sakamma because she was a child widow of a very influential coffee planter in Mysore. And then married, her husband's cousin brother had 2 wives and he passed away. She didn't have children, but she landed up adopting his 9 children to make sure that they weren't taken away by the crown. They had massive plantations and of course a lot of people eyeing them. And here was this young woman, she was 17 when her husband died. And so she took over this entire empire, moved to Bangalore, set up a coffee production company, sold to the king. Very inspirational. But I couldn't write about her because there was very little material. Later, I found all of Sakamma's, grandnephews and nieces. Exactly. Very famous Sakamma. But I didn't want to write, because again, you don't know what kind of a person she was. And later I've learned. So I created a character called Lakamma, who's sort of modeled on her. And but not to sort of take her character and make it away. So what do you do, Madhulika, when you come across real life characters?
I would not... real life characters in the Muzaffar books, they're very few and far in between. Because there's just like Shah Jahan at a distance. that's about it. But actually, I did not fully answer your last question because you told me to talk about my other historical novels as well. So I should talk about that because that is where the real life characters come in. So my other historical series is called The Delhi Quartet, and that is not detective; it's more literary, and it's a collection of 4 novels, of which 2 have been published so far. And the 2 novels cover the past 800 years of Delhi's history. So they begin at the first one begins in 1188, which is just 4 years before the Rajputs lose power on Delhi, and it goes till the invasion of Timur. And the second novel, which is called An Unholy Drought, which was published last year, that covers shortly after Timur's invasion and right up till Akbar's ascension. So in these novels, I've tried to bring in a few real characters, but there are people who are not extremely important, so you're not your usual. I try to bring in people who are unusual. So yes, though I must admit that I gave in to putting Razia there. So Razia Sultan is there in my first novel. Amir Khusro is there. But there are people whom I try to, as far as possible, not try and delve into what I don't know about them. So for instance, Amir Khusro is always shown from somebody else's viewpoint, and he is often shown reciting things which he actually said. So he recites his riddles. So he meets one little boy, and this little boy says something about the Bawli, which Nizamuddin was building, and Amir Khusro recites this riddle which he had, which was about the stars. The stars are like a thali full of pearls, which rotates upside down, but not one pearl falls. So I try not to put words into real characters' minds, I mean, into their mouths. So I try to do that. It does not often always, I don't always manage it, but yeah.
That's very interesting. So maybe Sadiqa, I'll ask you the converse. When you were writing your book, are there any non-real characters that you invented to give a backdrop? Or did you only stick to the characters who are in the court records and the newspaper records?
No, see, my book has to have a background. So one was what was going on in India. This was the pre-independence movement, and this very uneasy relationships between the Maharajas and the British, where they pretended to be very friendly, and this Tukoji Rao was a great friend of theirs, and they were increasing his gun salute every time and giving him medals and knighthoods and whatever. And the other background was the Tawaifs, from which lineage Mumtaz comes. So I had to do a lot of work on that, and to give it body, I got a lot of incidences from the mythology or the background of how the Tawaifs work, the heritage, and they were not really looked down upon until much later in Victorian times. They were the repositories of our art and culture. They were the one who, promoted or promulgated the tumris and a lot of music in a time when it was not written down, the music. So it's come to us through the lineage of the Tawaifs. And they had their own culture, they had their own traditions. And so I had to do a lot of research into that. So I have a few people I've pulled out from history who are very famous and had little legends attached to their names. So I've got those, very briefly though. And the other people who loom large in my book is, of course, the Maharaja and his right-hand man, who was really the skunk in the piece. And I have this girl's mother, who was a retired, they retired very early at about 34, 35. So she's a retired woman who banks on her daughter's earnings. So she's forever pushing her to earn more, try and get more gifts, and hint for various jewels and things like that, which this one wouldn't, for some reason, really was not interested. So the mother is a very, character I had to delineate. And the mother has a stepfather, a husband, who behaves like a stepfather to this girl, and then her sister and things like that. So there are a lot of characters, but they play very minor roles.
Was the mother in the court proceedings and the newspaper accounts, or was the mother from your imagination largely?
No, mother was there, very much there.
As a character, though.
As a character. And she used to be, actually this girl was a 4th generation Tawaif. So she had a very proud lineage. I mean, they weren't looked down upon or didn't look down upon themselves. They were, musicians and they were singers and dancers and whatever. So the mother was, I think, in the employ of Bhupinder Singh of Patiala, who gave her a lot of retirement benefits and things like that. And then they depend on the daughter's things. The mother was very much there, and mother was always against her leaving the palace and going elsewhere. And she was forever trying to push her back into it and conspiring with the Maharaja to get her back. And her stepfather, that is the step-husband of this lady, he was also paid off or bribed to bring her back to the palace. So there were a lot of people around her who were, conspiring to get her back, where it was, all very well for them in the sense.
So that actually then, one of the challenges with history, and I'll come back to, I think one of the questions I do want to ask is how do you do your history? But before this, what I want to know is how much of it is imagination? One of the things I find, at least in Bangalore, I mean, I think this is true for all Indian history, much more so for a time period in which you are writing, Madhulika, is that history is written by the dominant few. And for instance, in Bangalore, it's always written by the British and in the archival records. And occasionally you will see the Indian voice of the administrator poking through. Maybe some memoirs of women written, like 3 or 4, a handful. But the hardest thing is to write the domestic voices of women. So for that, for instance, I go to family, my mother's memories of, and aunt's memories of their grandparents, my times with my grandparents. And I think, so some of it, I mean, because 1920s is easier. My grandfather was born in 1897, my grandmother in 1908, so you can pull some of those memories from real life. And for me, at least because we do a lot of ecology work, it's with oral histories of, let's say, grazers and cowherds and those kinds of things. Those histories we get from actual voices of, and their lives have in some sense may not have changed that much when we did, so we're talking to people in their 70s and 80s. But how do you get the emotional? One of the things I found most poignant in your books was the conversations between Muzaffar Jung and his wife when he goes to a Hindu's house and she said, you went to a Hindu's house. Or the part where he's the whole day in this he goes back to the Hindu's house and he's hungry and he wants to eat, and they sort of make an offer but very half-heartedly, and it's obvious that he has to refuse because otherwise they're going to throw all the vessels away. How do you write things like that? How much is imagination? How do you put yourself in history?
In that case, it is a lot of imagination because I try to put myself in the character's place. I think, as you said, trying to do research on the domestic aspect of it is very difficult. Yes, there is stuff on the Mughals and Mughal era, but actually, if you do research, so most of the research material out there, at least not primary research, but I'm talking about secondary research, and you'll see that stuff like what people ate or how they lived, what they wore, all are revolving around the Mughal royal family. It's not the everyday people. It's very difficult to tell what they ate, right? So I've had to go to, sort of food historians like K.T. Achaya and all to try and figure out, okay, what would people have been eating? Or, it's required a lot of research and a lot of filling in the blanks with what I think, for emotions and how people might have, the sort of prejudices they might have had, and the sort of social churn. You do read that, okay, there were these schisms happening, and so I'm trying to sort of imagine from that one sentence that there were schisms, that, okay, how would it have translated into everyday life? So it's a lot of interpolation, extrapolation, imagination. So it's convoluted.
But I think that's the writer's art, right? To help you, and this is why I was saying, at least for me, when I start reading history, I have to read it this way, to imagine myself. And I think it's the way in which you write that makes you imagine yourself living in the times, and then you can go around and, do the research of this. So I think, those passages for me really held true. And for me, in your book, Sadiqa, it was the parts where, again, her conversations with her mother. initially when her mother's preparing herself for the first night with the king, how she's, dressed up and put in this room and she doesn't know what to expect. And then later the conversations with the king when he's unburdening himself to her and the relationship between her and the king. How did you come up with all of those? Was there anything else that you could draw on, or it was just...
No, you just, like she said, you imagine yourself in that place. But I must tell you a very small incident. I was reading one of these Mughal history books by Indu Sundaresan. She's a very famous writer. And she's written a series of books which are excellent. And I think she does her research in US. So the books are fabulous. But at one point of time, I read a piece where the Mughal princess calls her father Pitaji. Oh, that put me off so much, the rest of the book just had no value in my mind, because how could a Mughal princess call her father Pitaji? Now that little bit, she couldn't get anywhere else. Where do you find what a princess calls her father? So what she chose was something wrong, and it really put me off her entire book, which is unfair to her, but So you have to be very careful of the details, and the details are what really get you in the end.
That's true. So that actually is a perfect segue to my next question. Why Delhi? Why this period for you? I mean, it is very easy to write about contemporary periods. And what made you select? Did you select the character and therefore the story? Did you select the story and then the character, or the place and the setting and the time appeal? How?
It actually happened very differently. You know what happened? When I was about 13 years old, I read this historical detective novel called The Chinese Maze Murders. It is by this man called Robert Van Gulik, who wrote this entire series set around a Chinese judge called Judge D. Judge D was a real character, right? He was a real person, and he was a magistrate in medieval China. And what happened was that Judge D became so famous across China that the Chinese started inventing detective novels with him as the hero. And Robert Van Gulik, he read some of these novels and he said, this is a good thing, we should show it to the outside world. So he started adapting these novels into English. And so what he would do, he would get rid of the extraneous things like, Judge D is being helped out by ghosts and things like that. So he would convert that into something which would work for a Western audience. So he did this. And I got hooked on to those novels. When I was about 13, I read the first one. After that, within about 7-8 years, I read all of those. Then I read Stephen Saylor, Ellis Peters, and like huge number of all the historical detectives I could get hold of. And I said, there's no Indian detective. There's no Indian historical detective. Back then there was none. So I said, okay, if there's not one, I will invent. And I had been staying in Delhi since I was 12 years old, right? So Delhi is it was natural that I would set it in Delhi because that's the place I'm most familiar with. And then when it comes to Delhi, when I think of historical, there's Old Delhi, right? It's Shahjahanabad. And then it was like, it's also that for somebody who's doing, who's not doing primary research in Persian and stuff, my research is, through Bambar Gascoigne and all these other Mughal writers. I mean, people writing about Mughal history. So it was, sort of a done thing that it had to be Mughal, because lots of available information, and it's a very colorful period. There's so many interesting things happening, and just so exotic, even though it's not actually. So that is why.
I mean, of course, as an ecologist, the bit that caught my attention in Crimson City, she has a very nice part about Muzaffar Jung when he's very young, going with his brother-in-law, who's like an adoptive father, hunting. And there's a leopard with leopard cubs, and there's a deer with deer cubs, and you kill the deer, you don't want to because the cubs have to grow up. But if the leopards don't eat, if the leopard doesn't eat, then her cubs won't grow up. And but in this dilemma, which gives you a sense, I guess, of the idea of writing it to show you Muzaffar Jung's character as a human being. In this is the backdrop of Mughal hunting and how they thought about the hunt, which is absolutely fascinating, exactly. So then, I mean, I guess, see, for me, Kaveri sort of popped into my head because I was doing all this research on Bangalore. But originally I set her in 1890s Bangalore, not in 1920s. Because Ronald Ross, I had a medical mystery in mind. And Madhulika and I were talking before this, just before, about how difficult it is to write your first book, especially if it's a mystery book, because it needs to have the clues and it needs to be plotted. And it took me 14 years to write the first one. I think you 7 years to write the first one. And so my first version was completely different. It was because Ronald Ross was the Nobel laureate who discovered that mosquitoes cause malaria. And he was a health officer in Bangalore during an outbreak of cholera. And that was the time cholera vaccination was going on. And it's around the time that he was doing his investigations into malaria and mosquitoes. So I had this whole medical mystery set in the 1890s, all about malaria and mosquitoes and cholera and the vaccine. And in the backdrop of 10% of Bangalore dying because of plague, cholera, and hunger, and all kinds of other things. And it wasn't going very far. I mean, I would get to 60% and stop, get to 60% and stop. And then I discussed with my agent, who's also an old school friend. I said, this is not moving beyond this. And she helped me figure out. She said, you're trying to write a cozy mystery, which is really lighthearted and domestic. And as much as murder mysteries can be cheerful, mine are cheerful, right? And against the backdrop of 10% of Bangalore dying because there's plague and cholera and hunger and famine, it's not working, and no wonder it's not working. So then since I was no longer tied to Ronald Ross and this topic, though I mean I spent so much time doing the research on.
You should do that sometime.
At some point, because I have so much on cholera and vaccines, and so at some point, a different story sometime. But so then I looked at 1920s Bangalore, and the reason was because 1890s were very difficult to write about because there's almost nothing. By 1920s, the newspapers come, and the newspapers are such a rich source. I mean, of course, you have the archives, but the archives are sort of all the facts, and you don't have the masala, so to speak. And the masala comes from the newspapers and the other accounts, the letters, the intrigue, And like the Karnataka archives has this whole section called secret, and I've never been able to get into them, but there's always this. You want to know what's happening, what's the gossip, where's the stuff that you put in. So that, so why? I mean, for you, was it the incident that you picked and then everything came along?
Incident was there. It was all set. I mean, there was nothing that I digressed from the truth. It was a very true story because it made headlines all over the world. Because suddenly the world woke up to the fact that these Indian Maharajas had such decadent lives where they had the mistresses and they were bumping people off and they'd go on shikar and kill off their enemies. And, so this decadent lifestyle came open to the world because of this Mumtaz, because she made some headlines. And the whole world was saying, who's this Mumtaz that the Maharaja is ready to abdicate because of her, he's giving up his throne. So, sorry, what was your question? I'm digressing.
Why did you pick this location? I mean, was it, why this setting? Because
it's a true story.
Why this story?
I don't know, I just found it very intriguing because even in my last book, which is called Mayurkhand, the story is again about a courtesan. So I probably find them very fascinating. And because I have an interest in classical music. So this allows me to bring in old tumris and dadras and, singing, and it brings my interest back into it that way.
No, and I saw the mention of Gauhar Jan because I have a little bit of Kaveri in book 3, in book 4, not yet, dancing to a record of Gauhar Jan. And you're right. All these links that you find, sometimes which are very fascinating.
Little details. And then I imagine this 13-year-old being presented in court. So I've got little details like, she finds these zari things very uncomfortable and she's sweating and her armholes are, because that comes from my own background where as a child you had to wear these heavy things to a wedding and then you were cursing away because they were poking into you and So that kind of thing, I imagine this 13-year-old, she really doesn't know what's happening. She does what her mother tells her. And she's very uncomfortable and she has all kinds of things. She has this friend back home in where they had stayed for a brief while in Hyderabad. So she wants to take presents for her and, chappals and jutis and all because you get all this in Indore and you don't, so you start with a child's imagination and then you bring her up to a point where she's rebellious about the whole thing.
So one more question then, because so if I'm thinking about my book and I'm writing for contemporary audiences today, at least for me, I mean, you're writing real incidents and changing it. I had to change something. This is something I've been asked a couple of times. I've been thinking about what have I changed to make my story palatable to Western audiences. Two things I know for sure I've changed. One is the fact, well, three I'd say. One is the fact that Kaveri is 19 and she's just, so when I started it, I wanted she and her husband to be exploring their romance of their life together. But obviously she would not be 19 in the 1920s and just married. There's no way I could have figured that. So I made her 16 when she was married and she was studying, so she hadn't moved to her husband's house. At 19 is the first time they lived together. But in reality, I mean, I'm just thinking of, how women were. My father's sister was born in 1924 and she got married at 13. My grandmother at 1908 got married at 12. I think these were not uncommon of those times and, educated for.
So I tell you one of the most interesting things. My maternal grandmother got married in her 20s and she was working till she was like at least in her 30s. She was working as a nurse.
So when was she born?
I don't remember. Sometime in the early 1900s.
This is very interesting.
So it's very interesting and very unusual, that you'd have somebody getting married in her 20s and going on working as well.
Absolutely, yes. No. And I know a friend's grandmother who was then in Kerala, again married, born in the 1910s or so, and then later became principal of a women's college, married in her 1930s. And her husband stayed home. He was a bit of a wastrel and didn't do much, but very few women of the time. So, yeah. So this is one thing I had to change. I could not have a 12-year-old or 13-year-old heroine. And, so I made her 16 and then 19. The other thing I changed was family sizes. Because everybody would have had a family of 7, 8, 10, 15, kids. And if you have that many characters in an Indian novel, and you have, some 75 first cousins on this side, 75 first cousins on the other side, all coming in and out of houses, you can't have a mystery. Yeah. So what did you change?
I agree with that completely, especially when I'm writing the Delhi Quartet. It's a saga. So each book spans about 150 years. So anyway, you have a large cast of characters. And then, if you have people with 10 children each and 9 children each, then you can't. So, okay, people have 5 children and 3 of them they get conveniently killed off along the way. So that is one thing. Then another thing which I find it a little difficult to get used to is the fact of mortality. You don't realize that living in this day and age, that when you look back at, say, the 1500s, people had a sort of average life expectancy of 25 years or something, So that was why getting married at 12 was a good idea, So at least you had time to have another generation before you copped it. So anyways, that was one thing that people in my novels tend to live longer than the real life characters would have lived. Talking specifically about Muzaffar Jung, one of the things which I did was to change the whole idea of punishment. Because Mughal criminal law did not call for, say, the death penalty for murder. You murdered somebody, and unless that person happened to be a really high-ranking nobleman, perhaps a member of the royalty or something, you would get off with a fine. You would pay a certain amount of money and that's it. And that I thought would not really gel with a modern audience. You're used to, murder is the highest or the lowest of crimes, as you would say, and that deserves murder. The capital punishment or at least, sort of life imprisonment or whatever. So that was one thing I did.
Interesting. And, one more thing I had to do is make sure that my protagonist had a husband who was very supportive. And because if you didn't really, there had to be, for a woman of those times, you had to have one supportive man at least, because if you're bucking the trend so much as to be a detective. And most of the women I read about of those times, like the coffee entrepreneur Sakama, or there was a journalist Kalyanama, were child widows whose fathers were the ones who stood behind them. And I wanted Kaveri to be married, so obviously for her it had to be her husband. But did you have to change anything, or because you're writing about a time and an incident that actually happened, you could talk about it? I mean, for instance, a 13-year-old who gets... In those times, it was it was a norm, but now we would be horrified today. We would talk about it as a child, and they didn't think of her as a child in those days.
That's true. And it was the norm, like you said, but the British were horrified. The rest of the world, where this went on to the media outside, were completely horrified with this guy being a pedophile or whatever. And, and his status with the British government fell like that, because he was a blue-eyed boy of theirs, because he didn't obviously overtly participate in the independent movement. So he was cultivating, the rebels and the government people. And at one point of time, he rewards her because she resists the advances of a British official in a mehfil or whatever. So he is very happy with her and he rewards her.
So is that true? Because I remember no, that's something you made up.
What else would have happened? It's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's it. And so you imagine her in that situation, and what would fascinate her, what would fascinate the others, and so all that is not given anywhere. It's only the basic outline of her running away and then being hounded to go back in. That's it.
Looking at the time, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll open it up to audience questions. So the last thing I have is, to me, all our books, though they're history and there's crime, they're really about a theme I won't say they're about social issues, because that makes them sound very preachy and boring. But there's clearly something at the back that is bothering each one of us, that we're trying to get out in some form through this fiction. So what is it for you, Madhulika?
I think, even though social issues sounds preachy, but I think that is something which comes across in a lot of detective fiction, actually. If you come to, it's just that the social issue is shown as in an entertaining sort of a way to sort of make you aware of it, but not getting bogged down by it. So I think it is there. And I think in Muzaffar Jung, I'm trying to show something of the decadence of the Mughal society. Muzaffar is a bit of he's a little on the outside, actually. But yes, there is, he sees the sort of the double standards and the corruption in, the moral sense, as well as, just the very fact that the empire was already starting to go down. Muzaffar's stories are set in the last years of Shah Jahan's reign. And he can already see, and those who have their eyes open can also sort of guess that things are going to go wrong in a hurry. So I think that is one thing which I wanted to show, that the precarious nature of the empire, as well as sort of the schisms which I talked about, social barriers, which had been there before and were getting enforced. And I think, of course, nowadays, of course, you talk about the last years of Shah Jahan, the coming of Aurangzeb. All you have to do is say Aurangzeb and everybody knows, about the schisms and stuff like that. So yeah, I wanted to touch upon that a bit and try and show that perhaps not everybody was that bigoted, So not everybody felt that, okay, there's this insurmountable barrier and you're on that side and we're on that side and that's how we will stay. So I did want to sort of show that as well.
Thanks. And I think that comes through beautifully in the books, because there's all, like I said, many of the little incidents that you'd really see. And you do talk about in your author's note the fact that now what you have is then Shah Jahan dies, but before that there's the Bijapur Sultanate and their collapse, and all of India itself and the boundaries of, well, there was no India, but all of these different kingdoms and their boundaries. This was a time of great flux, right? And I was just thinking about that, because 1658, that's the time soon after this that Shahji, I don't know how many of you know, because most of you are from Bangalore, I guess, but that Shivaji's father took over Bangalore for some time, and Shivaji was actually married here. And after his younger brother Venkoji got Bangalore, Shivaji and Venkoji fought for Bangalore, and Shivaji took over Bangalore, and in a very insulting gift to to Venkoji's wife, gave it to her for her chudi bangla, so for her bangle support. He gave the bangla back, and then she sold it. So then they sold it to the Mysore king. Venkoji didn't want it anymore after this. He sold it, and the Mysore king got it for whatever was the equivalent of 1 lakh of, the coins of those days. And he paid the money, and then the Mughals came and took it over. So 3 years later, he had to pay them all over again. So he paid twice for Bangalore. And I'm making all these links when I'm looking at what you're talking about. There's Bijapur, there's Delhi, and then there's Aurangzeb's people who turn up in Bangalore just after this guy's paid and before he can take the city, and they've taken over Bangalore. So, so lots of parallels, I think, with the country and moving. But for you, yes, you said the incident interested you, but beyond that, what were the ideas? What was the, at least I think for all of us, in a way, writing is therapy for various things that bother us, and you work it through fiction.
I found that this little girl, she was all of 25 when this murder happened. She's very, thinks for herself, and she comes from this very defranchised people. The wives were, they were not disrespected, but they were not accepted in society. And she thinks for herself, she knows what she wants, and she's willing to stand up against the whole world. And in the end, her rebellion, or whatever you call it, is responsible for this dethroning of this very famous, very rich and powerful king. He has to abdicate his throne because she stood her ground and she wanted to fight it to the end. And she refused to go back. The easier thing would have been for her to give in and say, okay, I'll go back and whatever. She stood her ground, even in the face of dire poverty, because from riches of the palace, Lalbagh Palace, she had to come stay in a chawl in Bombay, and in one room the whole family stayed, and no wonder her mother was so resentful. So, but she stood her ground, which I find very, very admirable in somebody of that class and that time. So I read somewhere in the newspapers that she went into the court and she could barely speak English, so with these very famous lawyers were grilling her. So she stood and held her ground and said, they said, would you go back to the Maharaja? She said, no, he can kill me, but I will not go back. I'll jump into the sea first. She was that adamant at 25. So as I wrote about her, I grew to admire her more and more.
And I think you have quoted some of the things that Jinnah and the other lawyers, such insulting comments about her that it really makes your blood boil. And you think to face that.
That's true, to face that and the way they sort of, the media, but finally the media forced this British to take action against the Maharaja. Otherwise it would have all been buried like so many other cases. But the media took up the cause and they wanted him brought to book, because under a treaty that he had signed with the British, he couldn't be brought to court. He couldn't be charged with anything. And this was murder, although by his minions or whatever, but he was the kingpin behind it. So the media got after them, and finally the British had to kneel, and they gave him a choice. They said, either you come to court and have this thing played out against you, or you abdicate. So he chose to abdicate in favor of his son Yashwantrao. So these are all historical facts, but the story behind it is so much more interesting.
As stories always are. Well, with that, I think I'll just open it up for questions. And I have many more questions of mine, but we'll get to them only if we don't have audience questions.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. I think my question is applicable to all three speakers. Because you're writing of a time period where things like misogyny were very predominant, but also very normalized. Not to say that it's not today, but back then it was not seen as something to be talked about as different or something to be damned. So how do you as writers handle themes of misogyny or seeing women as inferior in your writing?
My woman is not inferior at all. At least she doesn't think she is. So, by giving her that strength of will, she comes through as somebody equally powerful as a patron or whatever that is. So she fights for her rights. So she does not see herself as a weak person. And that in turn gives her the power. So that is...
I think I'll add to that, because even in my historical writing, okay, Muzaffar Jung is a man, but his his outlook towards women, the women around him, is very different. So he goes to his sister for a lot of advice and stuff. And that when he gets married, one of the reasons he actually tells the woman he marries that it's not your beauty I admire your mind. So it's he goes to her for a lot of advice, and she actually helps him in several of his cases. So, but putting that aside, the Delhi Quartet, the other historical this thing which I'm talking about, that has several women characters. In fact, there are reviewers who said that they'd read An Unholy Drought again just for the women characters. So yeah, I think what I'm doing is I'm bringing 21st century feminist sensibilities to my writing. So it's not, I know it's not a very, perhaps a very real depiction of what life actually was back then. But then also, I think that there really were women. They might have been the exception, but there were women who did have agency and who sort of took things into their own hands and said, we'll do it. So yeah, I'm thinking that, okay, the women I'm writing about are those exceptions.
So both of these are very interesting responses. I'll add mine, so one of the things that I've been looking for is how did women feel in those times when misogyny happened? And some of them, of course, perpetrated this themselves because they were part of the same system, but some of them responded to it differently. And there is, I don't know if you've seen a beautiful anthology of women writing in India by Susie Tharu and I can't remember and in the part 2, they pick up there's this Bengali woman's diary that they pick up, which was somebody's aunt forgotten, and they pulled it out of a trunk. But this is a woman who taught herself to write when she was a grandmother, and she talks about how she wanted to study in school, married at 13 again, large Brahmin house, had to do all the housework. She talks about her husband laughing at her when she wanted to study, her children laughing at her when she wanted to read and write. And the most poignant part for me is a 3-day period where she cooked for the whole family and couldn't eat herself because something happened each time and she wasn't able to eat. And nobody in the family realized that she hadn't eaten while feeding everybody. So Uma auntie, the Kaveri's gossipy neighbor, is the one who breaks down and tells Kaveri, you are teaching me how to read and write because my husband didn't and my son didn't. And she's really inspired by that woman. So, where do you find these bits and pieces? As Madhulika saying, they're few and far between. But you find them sometimes and you can put them in to understand how women lived through that. But I think we're also writing for contemporary times. So where we find strong women, we're going to highlight them. Maybe they were few and far between, but it's something that we would like to write about. It's a lovely question.
Hello, my question is to the entire panel. So my question is, if I were to venture into the world of historical fiction, so what is that one advice you three would give to me? Because historical fiction is not very easy to deal with, especially with facts and figures and how you're able to use your imagination to fill the gaps. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Research, 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 research. So at least you get your background is so clear in your mind that you will not hesitate anywhere. And after that, you build on that. Your let's say your canvas is so broad that you need to delve deep into it, which I'm sure Madhulika has done for her Mughal times.
No, but when you said research, I was going to say I would add to that research. Because seriously, you can't do too much research. It's just not possible. You need to get so completely into it that, if, like, for instance, for the Muzaffar Jung books, I did so much research on Shah Jahan's period, and not the political thing, not, how was Shah Jahan expanding his empire or what was happening, not that. But things like what did people eat, how was Delhi's Thana system organized. So all those sort of things, I got so much into it that at a time, if you sort of sent me a message and said, write a Muzaffar Jung story or something, I would be able to give it to you in 2 days. Because my research was all done. And even now, I can pretty much, even though it's been like 10 years since the last Muzaffar Jung book was published, I still remember all of that. So, yes, research. Lots and lots and lots of research. And I think finally, when you come to that end where you realize that there are gaps, because your research is so thorough, you will know what is the most logical way to fill those gaps, you know. And of course, when you're writing fiction, the good thing about writing fiction is that nobody's going to kill you for taking liberties, right? You write non-fiction and you take liberties, you're sunk. But when you're writing fiction, it's fine. And see, the thing is, if you can't find a way to fill the gap, fiction means then you turn your story around. If you don't want to take liberties, you find another way to tell your story.
And I'd also say that I find different ways of your research. Look at photographs to give you a sense of the ambience. Look at recipes to get you a sense of the food. Look at the facts and the figures to tell you population. You know, so for instance, my latest Kaveri book is set in Coorg, and I found this very interesting thing on the population of men and women and the differences. So I had some reason for somebody to ask a name, and that fact comes out. So you find something interesting. Or I found something in British Museum, British Library, which is not even in Bangalore, but they used a vacuum cleaner, and Kaveri loves science. And I said, okay, vacuum cleaner in the 1920s, I have to have this vacuum cleaner in Bangalore. So you'll find something that is interesting, but to do the research, you have to love the period. So first pick a period that you love, and then the research will be fun, because otherwise you do so much research, it can get overwhelming if it's not fun. So if it's not fun, that's...
One last thing, try to go to places which still exist, because if you're in that ambience, you sort of get, I don't know, it sort of always inspires me.
Okay, good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Sudeep. I'm a history student from Christ. My question is specific to Madhulika, ma'am. So your book is, it's set in the 17th, 18th century?
1656, 17th century.
Okay. So the crime scene investigation techniques and the forensic tests that exist today did not exist back then. And the main character here is a detective. So how did you come up with the investigation techniques or the ways through which he investigates?
The major thing is that he observes. His power of observation is very important. So there are things like there are little clues. For instance, somebody gets an anonymous letter which is bound with a thread which has left a blue mark on the paper. And just by looking at the type of thread, he knows people who work in the weavers department, in the weavers area of the city, and he's able to go to them and he's able to to find out, okay, how is this, where would this have come from and stuff. So that is the sort of thing. Or for instance, there were chemists called attars who at that time also had a certain level of knowledge of, say, poisons and things like that. So he has a friend who is an attar, to whom he goes now and then to try and figure out, okay, what is this thing which has killed somebody, So he uses those sort of forensic techniques, but the most important thing is the observation. I purposely did not want to write a contemporary detective novel, because I think today's forensics leave no scope for a detective to actually show his brain power. Because when you have your DNA testing and you have your fingerprinting and you have CCTV cameras, there's not that much left for a detective to actually show as far as his brain is concerned. I wanted to have something closer to the Sherlock Holmes sort of idea.
Thank you.
There was one question somewhere.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for the amazing discussion. So my first question is mainly for Madhulika, ma'am. So your character is a noble in the Mughal times. How did you give him this empathy, and how did you make him non-bigoted? How did you give him a feminist? Like, how did you make him a feminist? How did you separate him from the materialistic life that these Mughal nobles had? That's my first question. And my second question is to all three of you. How do you make conversations feel fleshed out and bring characters to life, rather than making it look like you're speaking through these characters? How do you make them feel like individual people of that time period with their own unique character tropes, basically?
How do you make it feel like an actual dynamic and like original conversation that's not coming through your mouth?
Okay, I think I'm going to sort of really put your questions awry, because my first question is going to negate the second one. The first answer is going to negate the second. The first answer is that Muzaffar Jung is actually a reflection of me. He is me. So there's a lot of him, like for instance, Harini, you would have noticed he's very fond of nature. So he he loves going out into the forests, and he loves watching birds and stuff like that, right? That is one thing. He's very fond of coffee, as I am. And he's a feminist, as I am. And he's not bigoted, as I am. So Muzaffar is actually me. He's actually me. And I'm unashamed about saying that he is not your normal Mughal nobleman. So he's different, and he is me. Talking about how conversations would reflect the characters, I don't know if that really works with me. I think a lot of my conversations end up being a reflection of what I am, but where, of course, what happens is that not all your characters are like you, right? There are some people, I hope I don't reflect certain villains, right? So I think one thing which works for me is to try and read out the dialogue. Not just write the dialogue, but then try and read it out and understand, does this work when it is spoken? Because I think when you speak a dialogue, then you can tell, is this actually working, or is it going overboard?
I think the dialogue part is very hard. Sometimes you know the characters well, some characters you don't know so well. And we're all writing in English about dialogues that took place in different Indian languages. It's not easy. So for instance, I'll give you just one example. I was trying to think of women at one party that came together. And I was walking past, went to a wedding, and there were these two older ladies talking and in Tamil and said, vata, 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 and pesilka. So I said, okay, Kaveri's got these people, and one woman is saying, my mother-in-law went on, vata, vata, vata. And I use the word vata, vata, because it gives you a sense of that flavor of the language, right? So sometimes you just keep your eyes and ears open where you can find something. Dialogue is something I always struggle with. Each of us has our strengths and our weaknesses. So for me, I'm always looking for something that actually is from a real dialogue that I can put in and make it realistic.
I think for me, dialogue flows out of the character. Once you have a mental image of who the person is, you know exactly what she's going to express, what he's going to say, and So that comes out of having a very definite image of the character in your mind. Then the dialogue just comes. And given a situation, look, human beings are the same everywhere, anytime. So it's a very human interaction at any given time, given the flavor of the times, let's say. Like the yada yada. So it's just given a twist to fit in with the particular situation and the times, but the humanness of the people remains, that it still is the humanity of the people concerned.
There was a question this side. Oh.
I can ask if there isn't a student. Go ahead.
Thank you for the amazing talk, ma'am. So since we had such an elaborate discussion about courtesans, women, and the Mughal era, so there was this series out, Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Hira Mandi, and it was very controversial because some people took to the fact that it was over-glorified and it was not depicted as it actually was. So because you've researched so much while writing your books, if you've come across texts which actually tells you the truths, the entire truth about the courtesan and the Tawaif system, if you could throw some light on that.
Look, cinema being such a populist media, they have to glamorize it. Otherwise, how would so many people go and see it? So I'm sure that Hira Mandi was heavily glamorized. And, the traditions they showed and things is what was. But he's added a whole lot of fancy dresses and palaces and chandeliers and things to make it very palatable to the masses. So I'm sure it wasn't like that, but he's done a lot of research into the core of how these people functioned. So that, I think, is true to life, but he's over-glamorized it. You know, when you have stars like whoever there is, that Monisha Koirala, whatever, you have to glamorize them, you have to make them very gorgeous. So that's what he did. So Hira Mandi was a place, and I'm not sure that it was very active in the independence movement, but it was very much a very place where these nobles went and where people went, sent their sons to be educated in the appropriate customs of the time, in the tehzeeb as they call it of the time. So that itself is true in India, Pakistan, everywhere. But that glamorization is a fact of life in Indian films.
Should I go?
You had something? Do you want to?
Yeah. Shall I go? Or
Yeah, you
should
can
we?
go first and then.
Okay.
And then.
So I wanted to thank you for the lovely discussion. It was really fun to listen, and I'm going to go down and pick up the books also, because I love historical fiction. I'm a historian, but I love historical fiction. I've read all of Philippa Gregory. All my friends who studied Tudor England, like, how could you be reading her? Forgive me for saying historian friends, but I like the travel writing and historical fiction done by William Dalrymple until he declared himself to be a historian. So I truly enjoy this. But as I was listening to you guys, a thought came to me is nostalgia the theater on which this fiction is staged? Yeah, that's one, that there is an element of, like you said, choose the period that you like. So is there an element of that? And as you guys write, who do you imagine your audience to be? Because I think that's a big difference between what my craft and yours is, that I'm omnipresent when I'm writing and all of that. We're not thinking really about audience, but here is a craft that thrives on being read in a particular way, your work. So and what has been the response to your writing? What kind of I'm sure you must have sold lots of books to be able to write again and again. Yeah, so, but what are the different kinds of responses? Responses that you really liked, responses that really hurt. So I just want to understand, what was it for you to be a writer in the market and write?
I can start maybe with lovely questions. So for me, nostalgia is a big part of it. I mean, as an ecologist, of course, I'm back to the Bangalore of the 1920s, because that's when the lakes and the trees and the beauty of the city. Also the cosmopolitan nature, the nature of acceptance of people from different backgrounds coming together. So there's a big part. There's also the recreating the therapy part that I was talking about. The fact that so many women in my own houses, with my mother-in-law's side, my mother's side, grandmothers, could never get to read, study. And you were asking me about patriarchy, and there was so much about, I think women still felt it. I mean, I know women who in their 90s now talk about the fact that I wanted to make something of myself, but parents didn't allow. And this is all they talk about at the end of life. So it's also a therapy of recreating. Kaveri can do it if the women in my life couldn't do it, right? So there's both elements of that. As regards to readers, it's very interesting. So one of the things that I write about, and again, it's the Western versus the Indian audience I find very interesting. I write about an arranged marriage and a couple is very much in love, which is sort of very obvious for us. There are arranged marriages of all kinds, just as there are love marriages of all kinds, and it would be common for us in India. But a reader from the US, who's a therapist from Africa, who moved to the US, she wrote to me and she said, I like your books because unlike most of the South Asian fiction or the African fiction set in the US, that people read in the US, you don't pathologize the suffering of Indian women. Oh, little light bulb went off my head. I hadn't planned it like that, but I said, yeah, of course, because there are Indian women that were exploited by men and Indian women that ran their houses and all kinds in between, right? So that's one part. But I also find it very strange when a lot of Indian women of today read, especially the younger ones, read it and say, her husband would never have cooked for her. I had grandfathers who were cooking. I learned cooking from my father. It was very common of certain generations. Or something like that women couldn't have run businesses. And here's Sakama who's running a coffee empire. So I find that also, which is very interesting. And it's the younger ones who see it. So I don't know if something has changed in Indian society or we're not aware of how things were.
I think I'd sort of more or less agree with that, because even for me, the Muzaffar Jung stories and of course the Delhi Quartet also have been a sort of nostalgia, and I think both of them because they pay tribute to Delhi, which is a city which I really love and which I know very well. So that is why that comes in, you know. So that is there. As far as the reception of my books goes, I've sort of had to accept that I'm writing for a very niche audience. You know, the historical detective part is even more niche than just the historical part. So there are people who are happily reading the Delhi Quartet, but who refuse to go into the Muzaffar Jung series because they feel it's too lowbrow. So because the Delhi Quartet is literary fiction, so it's historical literary fiction, so they feel that that is probably a little more intelligent and better researched or something, so they won't even go to Muzaffar Jung. And the interesting thing is, my latest book, which is out, is not historical. It's the first contemporary novel I've written. It's called For the Love of Apricots. It's a sort of a romance, which is a little offbeat. And that book is very popular. Because I've suddenly realized that, yeah, what I feared was right, that the audience for historical fiction is limited. So that is sad.
When you say niche, who do you refer to?
The niche is actually it sort of goes through all sorts of people. So I've had people who are very young, college-going students and all. In fact, the fourth book of the Muzaffar Jung series, Crimson City, is part of the curriculum at Delhi University. So suddenly, in fact, over the past couple of years, I've had a lot of people, young people, tell me, ma'am, I've read your book. And it's very good, and I love it, and stuff like that. So I'm getting a lot of love from that particular group. But I've had people who are older as well, people in their 50s and 60s who've enjoyed the books. So, but the numbers, when it comes to sheer numbers of people who want to read the book, those are appreciably lower.
I think you're right. Nostalgia plays a big role in people going back to those books. And the period that I'm writing about is just out of reach, just over with. So a lot of older than me, that is older than me people, like my parents and things, are very intrigued by what they have heard about or heard mentioned or gossiped about or whatever. That is becoming clear to them. So I've got a lot of emails from Indians settled abroad, professors who want my book, and then, they want it autographed and send it to their relatives in India. So it is a little older crowd. It's like, we grew up, when we were growing up, there was this Nanavati case. So that is still there in our minds, and we love details about it. So this is when they were growing up, they had this Holkar case. So it's the older generation basically which is reading this. And the younger ones are very intrigued by the whole courtesan concept. That's why I had to put that in the title. Although they said, why don't you just make it the Maharaja's mistress? I said, no, courtesans of great interest to even the younger generation. Like that Hiram Mandi, for instance, So it's something that we will never experience or see, or we've just seen it in the movies, or we've heard about it, and, so it's still very intriguing to us.
One last question. There was a young lady here who had, yes. Sorry, you can take yours.
Thank you. So my question, I want to give you some context. I'm only delving into historical fiction now. I do read history, but it's mostly with non-fiction. So how do you view a retrospective distortion? And we see a lot of non-fiction writers talk about this, but as a writer who writes fiction, how do you see that? And while fully being aware of the fact that there is a sense of nostalgia, there is a sense of other emotions, your inner conflict, then how are all those elements coming together?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
So when you say that you're nostalgic about what you're writing, but then don't you think that you're also looking back in retrospect and then writing? Like you're looking back from today and writing, so there's that sense of nostalgia. But there's also that controlled setting of the plot that you need to bring together, along with your own inner conflict about, the characters being different than what happened in that generation, like a feminist or someone who loves nature and is concentrating on those details. So how does that come together? Or the answer is rather simple, that because it's fiction, you get that independence to do that.
I think because it's fiction, you do get the independence, but you can't completely veer off. I mean, like Madhulika was saying, so you can pick strong women. Maybe strong women are overrepresented in your plot than they would be in reality. But if there were no strong women, or 1 in 1,000, you couldn't change that. So you have to go within the boundaries of what is
So
possible.
I think to add to that, if there were no strong women, you might lose a chunk of your audience. And if your audience is anyway rather narrow, then maybe not.
Though, I mean, I have to say, one thing I was told always when writing was that historical mysteries would be very niche. I have found it to be the opposite.
Oh.
And maybe it's a time at which you wrote. Because by the
I
time
think so.
I wrote, I think there were many writers like you.
Yeah.
And I think you
I was
made
the
way.
first. I was
Yes.
the first one to write historical detective fiction. People just couldn't get their heads around it.
Yeah.
They were like, why are you bringing a detective into Mughal India?
And whereas now you have such a
Now there's
resurgence
lots
in the
of it,
interest, so there's that interest that picks up.
I see it as a big cauldron of kind of soup, where some reality goes in, some incident that really happened, characters and the author's imagination. So it's all a mix, and somewhere it gels and comes out as a book. So you really can't separate the different threads that go into it. And a lot of threads do go into it.
Great, thank you. I know we have 2 questions, so maybe ask the questions, but they're not going to answer because you're going to answer afterwards. But we'd love to hear your questions.
Okay. Actually, it's not a question. It's a very big thank you to all the authors for being here, but a bigger thank you to Harini ma'am and Madhulika ma'am, because you both are a reason why my grandmom, my mom, and I sat and argued, or rather for the first time in my 34 years, sat down to speak together. So it was a conversation that I would want to just tell you about very briefly. Mummy has read all your books, Madhulika ma'am, and I've read Harini ma'am's books. I moved to Bangalore 5 years ago, and Mummy is like from Delhi. So she's like, beta, it used to be like this, like this, like this. And I hail from Hyderabad. Mughals come into my history forever. So there was this conversation between Mummy and me where we both are talking about how Bangalore was, how Delhi was, and my grandmom has seen Mughal era in Hyderabad side. And she just stepped over a conversation and it turned into a heated argument, and it's a core memory for my life. I mean, the cultural, no one knew about the hand washing tea culture. My grandmom still follows it when washing vessels. So in Hyderabad, when we talk about preparation of non-veg, when we talk about preparation of biryani, no one knows how it was core done back then. And I have seen so much of cultural diversity where my mom comes from Delhi, my great-grandfather comes from like Sindh side and stuff. That I never knew conversation starters can come from books, and that too bringing 3 generations together, 3 women. And the most epic part of that was my father ultimately came in, shall I make you women tea so that you guys can just calm down? And all of us are like, no, coffee. And he did not understand why coffee, because then we have Muzaffar, then we have Kaveri. And then I'm like, out of the blue, I'm like, wouldn't it be so nice if we had a banana tree? We would have just eaten in that, washed off the leaves there and then, because that came from the book's reference. So thank you for this core memory that you've given me for life. I go back to Hyderabad hoping I have another argument like this and at least have that as a memory. So thank you so much.
Thank you, that's lovely.
That's wonderful to hear. One quick question you had? Yeah, out here.
Thank you for the talk, 3 of you. A question I was curious to know is, because all of, especially Madhulika and Harini, have dealt with detective fiction, and I was very curious of the policing, right? So that, when you read, okay, I've just read Sherlock and Poirot and Satyajit Ray's Finney, so you always have a policeman, a character. They're usually antagonistic too. So I'm very curious, Madhulika, you spoke of Muzaffar's brother-in-law, Kotwal. So obviously you studied policing techniques, and then even with the detective, he had to be working with the police. So how did you put that into the story? And with you also, Harini, the late 1800s, did you go through police records? Because the detective would have been working with that. And did you try to create a same kind of policing system in your novels also? Especially, ma'am, yours I'm curious to know if there were policemen who were sympathetic to the courtese and to the lady there. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, 30-second answers from this policeman, time policeman here.
The Bombay policemen prided themselves on their efficiency, and they were very, let's say, cooperative with these people. And at various times, there were policemen posted outside her house because she was under threat by these minions of the Maharaja. So the policemen played a very, let's say, important role in getting the culprit right. So they were very, let's say, the policeman and the judge himself, after the entire court case was over and the people who actually did the murder were sentenced, he said the case is, no, he says the case is, the judgment has been declared, but the culprit goes free. Which means he knew who the real culprit was, but then he went through the motions of whatever. So the British were very much in sympathy with this girl and her mother. And the policemen were very cooperative.
So yes, I'll agree that the Kotwal, who is Muzaffar's brother-in-law, he is there in the whole thing. And one thing which I don't know if it's very clear in the books or not, which I tried to bring out, was that the Mughal system of policing in Delhi, for instance, Delhi was divided into 12 thanas, which were the jurisdictions. And each thana was under a thanedar, and they had chokidars and stuff like that to do the everyday policing. But the policing did not consist of, in fact, the whole thing of investigating crimes was a very minor part of the Kotwal's duties. So the thanedar, the chokidars and all, yes, they would sort of make sure that law and order was maintained somewhat. But they also did a lot of other things which we don't now think of as police work. So, for instance, organizing Eid, Diwali, other celebrations, then maintaining weights and measures, maintaining registers of births, deaths, marriages, things like that. So, a lot of things which now are divided across various administrative departments were pooled under the Kotwal's office. So actual investigation of crime, and that of crime at a very low level. You know, so for instance, you murder your neighborhood butcher or someone, nobody's going to come and really investigate that. You had to be somebody high up and important for anybody to investigate. And that is something which I thought a contemporary audience would not really care for, so that is not what I've done.
Yeah, there are couple of books which are British policemen of the 1800s to 1910s, writing largely from Bengal and other places, a little bigoted. You know, they'll talk about thieving castes and things like that. You have to filter through, but there are methods in that about which I used. Two of the things I was very fascinated with were blood typing and fingerprinting, which were the kinds of things Kaveri could have used. And fingerprinting, though we think was invented by a Western, a Britisher, it was basically the two Indian policemen that worked for him. So it is things like that that I chose to work with.
Thank you so much for this fabulous session. It's been absolutely wonderful to have all of you here. May you keep writing books. May there be more movies and OTT shows based on your books, maybe even directed by Sanjay Leela Bansali, so that we can say that the book was much better. For those whose interest is piqued by historical fiction, there's a wonderful database called citiesandfiction.com. You can see it on your phones. It's a database of Indian novels across cities, and if you just search historical fiction in the search bar, you're going to get a whole list of novels written on India. So that's a fantastic database to be aware of. Since we're in Bangalore, a book by K.R. Usha called A Girl and a River, which also has Kaveri as a protagonist. And two on the Vijayanagar Empire. Recently, Salman Rushdie, no less, called On Victory City, and Tejo Tungabhadra. Is another book which has come out recently. You can get their books at the stalls at the ground floor, so just outside the building. So you can get their books and try and find them. If they're missing, you have to write your own detective novel series. There are exhibitions on the 8th floor, so if you're going out, you have to walk down. Just a flight of stairs, and you'll see wonderful exhibits on history. Our next session is going to be on the history of photography. Right? It's a remarkable kind of theme, and we are going to be focusing on the northeast region of India. So it's a very special session, which will start in just about a minute from now. May I invite Professor Rakesh Basant to hand over the mementos to our speakers. Thank you so much.